In 1863, the United States Army purchased an estimated 9,000 bottles of Hostetter's celebrated stomach bitters and distributed them to Union soldiers stationed in the malarial lowlands of the Mississippi Delta. The product's label promised protection against the fatal maladies of the southern swamps. What it actually delivered was 47% alcohol by volume, higher proof than most whiskeys on the market, packaged in a dark amber bottle with no ingredient list, no dosage warning, and no legal obligation to provide either. David Hostetter had launched the product a decade earlier, compounding it in Pittsburgh and shipping it south and west along the same rail lines that carried grain and coal. By the time the war ended, his bitters were the best-selling patent medicine in the country. They sat on shelves in drugstores, dry goods stores, and general mercantiles in every dry county from Maine to Kansas. An 1856 advertisement promised that 2 bottles would cure bad livers and lend strength and cheerfulness. The same product was sold by the glass in saloons. Nobody saw a contradiction in this because there was no legal framework that required consistency between what a product claimed and what a product was. That's the part that takes adjustment. Not that one company got away with selling flavored whiskey as malaria treatment, but that every company could. There was no federal statute requiring a manufacturer to disclose what was inside a bottle, no agency empowered to test a product before it reached a customer, no mechanism for pulling something off the shelf after it killed someone. The question isn't how Hostetter's thrived. The question is what kind of legal architecture allows an entire marketplace to operate this way for over a century, and what finally breaks it. The answer, when it eventually arrives, involves a chemist, a squad of volunteers willing to eat poison for the government, a handful of journalists who made careers out of revulsion, and a string of dead children. But before any of that, there's the silence, 138 years of it. The Constitution's Commerce Clause, as courts interpreted it through most of the 19th century, granted Congress authority to regulate trade between states. In practice, that authority went almost entirely unexercised when it came to product safety. The prevailing legal philosophy held that the federal government had no business telling a manufacturer what to put in a bottle or a can or a sack of flour. If a state wanted to pass its own food purity law, it could. Some did. Most didn't bother, and those that did rarely funded enforcement. The result wasn't a loophole. A loophole implies a system with gaps. This was the absence of a system entirely, and into that absence flowed everything a manufacturer could get away with. Hostetter's was not an outlier. It was simply the most commercially successful version of a business model that hundreds of companies replicated. Patent medicines, so-called not because they held patents, but because the name carried a veneer of official approval, filled an entire economy. They promised cures for tuberculosis, cancer, epilepsy, impotence, alcoholism. Some contained nothing more harmful than sugar water. Others contained opium, morphine, cocaine, mercury, or enough alcohol to incapacitate a grown man. A mother could walk into any pharmacy in America and buy a teething syrup for her infant that contained morphine sulfate, and the label would say nothing about it, because no law required it to. The genius of Hostetter's advertising, though, was its honesty about the wrong thing. The company's own promotional materials at one point noted that the bitters were successful, chiefly because it contained more alcohol than any other nostrum. This was not a secret. It was a selling point. In a country where temperance movements had closed saloons and restricted liquor sales in dozens of counties, a 47% alcohol medicine available without restriction was simply a drink you could buy on Sunday. Everyone knew it. Everyone profited from the arrangement. And because no law defined what medicine meant, no law could be violated by calling whiskey a cure. So here's a world without consumer protection. Not in the abstract, not as a political philosophy, but as a daily lived reality for 300 million meals eaten every day across a growing nation. What did that world taste like? What did it smell like when you opened the bottle? Milk is a useful place to start because everyone drank it. In the 1880s and 1890s, urban milk delivery was a supply chain built on distance and time. A dairy farm outside the city produced milk in the early morning hours. By the time that milk reached a customer's doorstep, it had traveled by cart, sat in containers that were imperfectly cleaned, and aged in temperatures that accelerated bacterial growth. Spoiled milk was not a rare inconvenience. It was a daily commercial problem with a simple economic logic. A distributor who couldn't sell yesterday's milk lost money. The solution was chemical. A company called the Preservaline Manufacturing Company sold formaldehyde to dairies under the trade name Preservaline, marketing it as a harmless preservative that kept milk fresh for days beyond its natural life. Other manufacturers sold the same chemical under names like Iceline. The pitch was straightforward. A few drops per gallon prevented curdling, masked the smell of decay, and allowed distributors to sell milk that would otherwise be unsaleable. The fact that formaldehyde was an embalming agent, a substance used to preserve corpses, did not appear in the marketing materials. Neither did it appear on the milk bottle, because nothing appeared on the milk bottle. There was no label, and there was no requirement for one. A mother pouring a glass of milk for her child had no way to know she was administering trace amounts of the same chemical that undertakers used on the dead. Move from the dairy to the candy shop, and the palette of poison shifts, but the logic stays constant. Confectioners in the late 19th century needed color. Children bought candy with their eyes before their tongues, and manufacturers competed on vibrancy. The cheapest, most vivid colorants available were mineral pigments developed for industrial use. Lead chromate produced a brilliant yellow. Scheele's green, a copper arsenite compound, produced an emerald that no vegetable dye could match. Both were acutely toxic. Both were used in candy sold to children, and used legally because the concept of a banned food additive did not yet exist in American law. Canned vegetables presented a different aesthetic problem. Peas lost their color during the canning process, turning from bright green to a dull olive that consumers associated with staleness. Canners discovered that copper sulfate, dissolved in the canning liquid, restored the peas to a vivid green that looked fresh picked. The peas were no longer fresh, they were chemically altered, but they looked right, and looking right was worth more than being safe, particularly when being safe carried no legal reward and no competitive advantage. And then there was whiskey. Legitimate bourbon required years in charred oak barrels, which meant capital tied up in inventory, which meant expense. Rectified whiskey offered an alternative. Neutral grain spirits were flavored and colored with whatever achieved the desired result: sulfuric acid for bite, prune juice for body, burnt sugar for the amber color that consumers associated with age. Some rectifiers reportedly used tobacco spit to add complexity. The product was sold as whiskey, tasted enough like whiskey to pass casual inspection, and cost a fraction of the genuine article to produce. It was fraud, plainly, but it was legal fraud, because there was no legal definition of whiskey that it could violate. This was the world that Harvey Washington Wiley stepped into when he became chief chemist at the United States Department of Agriculture in 1883. He was 38 years old, trained as both a physician and a chemist, and he arrived in Washington with the methodical temperament of a researcher, not a crusader. His initial mandate was straightforward: analyze agricultural products and publish findings. Nobody asked him to start a war with the American food industry. But Wiley was a man who believed that the public had a right to know what it was eating, and when he started looking at what it was eating, the data was difficult to set aside. He began building a database. Not a public campaign, not a congressional petition, a database. Product by product, sample by sample, he and his staff at the Bureau of Chemistry documented what was actually in the food and drink sold across the country. He tested milk, canned goods, spices, honey, butter, coffee, and patent medicines. What he found was a supply chain saturated with substitution and adulteration, not occasionally, not in isolated cases of bad actors, but systemically. The practice was the norm. A product that contained only what its label claimed, in the rare instances where a label existed at all, was the exception. Wiley published his findings in Bureau of Chemistry bulletins that circulated within the government. They were dense, technical, cautious in their language. They did not read like exposés. They read like laboratory reports, because that's what they were. But the implications were explosive for anyone willing to follow them to their conclusion. The American food supply was, in aggregate, a system for delivering adulterated and frequently toxic products to consumers who had no means of knowing what they were buying. The question that began forming in Wiley's mind was simple enough to state and brutal in its political implications. If these substances were harmful, and if the public was consuming them unknowingly, then someone had to prove the harm definitively, in a way that couldn't be dismissed as theoretical, in a way that would force Congress to act. But proving harm from food additives presented a scientific problem that no one in 1883 had solved. The doses were small and the effects were cumulative. No single meal of formaldehyde-preserved milk would kill a healthy adult. The damage accrued over months and years, diffused across an entire population, impossible to trace back to a single source. How do you prove that a substance is dangerous when its danger is slow? Wiley spent nearly 2 decades on that question. He kept building his database, he kept publishing bulletins, he kept watching Congress do nothing while the evidence accumulated, and by 1902, he had an answer, one that was equal parts scientific experiment and public spectacle, and one that would make him, briefly, the most famous chemist in America. He recruited 12 volunteers, young men, all of them, drawn from the Department of Agriculture's own clerical staff. Healthy, between the ages of roughly 20 and 30, willing to sign a contract agreeing to eat only what Wiley's kitchen served them. The experiment was formally called the Hygienic Table Trials, but a reporter at the Washington Post saw something more vivid in it, and the name stuck: the Poison Squad. The design was methodical. Wiley isolated one additive per experimental period, Borax first, then salicylic acid, benzoic acid, formaldehyde, copper sulfate. The 12 men ate 3 meals a day in a basement dining room at the Bureau of Chemistry, cooked by a professional chef Wiley had hired specifically for the trials. The food itself was wholesome, only the additive changed, introduced in measured doses that increased over weeks. Every physiological response was tracked: weight, appetite, digestion, energy, kidney function. The men were weighed before and after each meal, and their excretions were collected and analyzed. Wiley was building a data set that he believed would be bulletproof. The newspapers loved it. The image was irresistible: 12 government clerks eating poison for science, monitored by a bearded chemist with a missionary's conviction. Vaudeville performers wrote songs about them. Political cartoonists drew them. Their motto, "Only the brave dare eat the fair," appeared in headlines from Washington to San Francisco. For the first time, the abstract question of food adulteration had human faces attached to it. Young men who were measurably suffering so that the public could know what its breakfast was doing to it. And the suffering was real. The borax trials produced nausea, loss of appetite, and measurable weight loss. Higher doses caused headaches, digestive distress, and cognitive fog that the volunteers described as a fullness of the head. Formaldehyde was worse. The men reported kidney pain, persistent nausea, and a deterioration in general health that took weeks to reverse after the additive was removed. Wiley documented all of it with the precision of a man who knew his data would be challenged. Every meal was recorded, every symptom was dated, and every dose was measured to the fraction of a gram. What he proved was clear enough. These substances, at the concentrations commonly used in commercial food processing, caused measurable physiological harm to healthy young men over periods of weeks to months. What he failed to prove, and what the food industry immediately seized upon, was causation at the dose levels present in any single commercial product. A manufacturer could look at Wiley's data and say, truthfully, that the borax content of one serving of their product was far below the doses that produced symptoms in the Poison Squad trials. The argument was technically sound and morally bankrupt, but it was effective because it reframed the debate from, are these chemicals harmful, to, are they harmful at this specific concentration in this specific product, a question that required years of additional research to answer definitively. This was the gap the industry exploited, and they exploited it with the full weight of their economic power. The congressional agricultural committees that oversaw Wiley's bureau and controlled its funding were not neutral arbitrators. They were populated by men with financial connections to the very industries Wiley was investigating. The canning industry, the patent medicine industry, the rectified whiskey industry, the preservative manufacturers, all had lobbyists in Washington. All had relationships with the legislators who determined whether Wiley's work would continue, expand, or quietly lose its funding. So the science was there. The press coverage was there. Public awareness was higher than it had ever been. And Congress did nothing. For 4 years after the Poison Squad trials began generating data and headlines, no food safety legislation reached a vote. The pattern was consistent. A bill would be introduced, referred to committee, and die there, suffocated by industry pressure applied behind closed doors. Wiley would testify, present his data, answer questions from legislators who already knew they would not act on his answers, and return to his laboratory to continue work that the political system had no intention of translating into law. What does that kind of institutional paralysis produce? Not silence, exactly. Wiley kept publishing, the newspapers kept writing, and the Poison Squad kept eating. But the gap between knowledge and action widened into something that looked permanent, a stable arrangement where everyone knew the food supply was contaminated, and nobody with the power to change it was willing to pay the political cost of doing so. The question hanging over Washington in 1905 wasn't whether the evidence existed. It did. It wasn't whether the public cared. They did. The question was, what specific pressure, what combination of outrage and timing and political opportunity would finally break the deadlock? Wiley had given Congress the science. Someone else would have to give it the politics. And that someone else was already writing. The someone else was, in fact, several people. And they were not scientists. They were journalists, and what they brought to the fight was not data, but something data had failed to provide: narrative. Specific stories about specific products killing specific people, told in language that didn't require a chemistry degree to understand, published in magazines that reached millions of American households every month. The first of them was Edward Bach, and his weapon was the Ladies' Home Journal. Bach had been editor of the journal since 1889, and by the early 1900s it was one of the most widely read publications in America. His readership was overwhelmingly women, which meant his readership was overwhelmingly the people who purchased patent medicines for their families. Bach understood something Wiley's congressional testimony never could have conveyed, that the patent medicine industry's primary customers were mothers treating sick children, wives treating ailing husbands, women treating their own chronic complaints with products whose contents were deliberately hidden from them. So Bach started naming names. Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound was among the most popular patent medicines in the country, marketed directly to women for menstrual pain, uterine complaints, and general female weakness. The advertising featured a grandmotherly portrait of Lydia Pinkham herself and invited women to write personal letters describing their symptoms, promising individualized advice in return. What Bach published was the compound's actual alcohol content, somewhere between 18 and 35%, depending on the batch. The medicine women were giving themselves for reproductive health contained more alcohol than most wines. The personal letters women sent to Mrs. Pinkham were being answered by a staff of copywriters because Lydia Pinkham had been dead since 1883. Bach published this. He published the alcohol percentages. He published the fact that the woman on the label was a corpse. And he published it in a magazine that sat on parlor tables in homes where alcohol consumption was considered a moral failing, where temperance was a religious conviction, where women had been unknowingly drinking the equivalent of several glasses of wine a day and calling it medicine. The response from patent medicine manufacturers was immediate and coordinated. They pulled their advertising from the Ladies' Home Journal. This was not a small financial threat. Patent medicine companies were among the largest advertisers in American publishing, and the loss of their accounts represented a significant portion of magazine revenue. Bach absorbed the loss and kept publishing. The result was that his readers trusted him more, not less, because he was visibly paying a price for telling them the truth. But Bach's campaign, for all its impact on public awareness, remained focused on a single category of fraud. The broader architecture of deception, the entire economic ecosystem that kept dangerous products on shelves, required a different kind of exposure. It required someone willing to go product by product, company by company, death by death, through the full catalog of what the patent medicine industry was selling and what it was doing to the people who bought it. Samuel Hopkins Adams was that someone. Adams was a journalist, not a crusader by temperament. He was precise, methodical, and deeply irritated by fraud. His 11-part series for Collier's Weekly, titled The Great American Fraud, began publication in October 1905, and it did something no previous reporting on patent medicines had attempted at this scale. Adams named the products, the manufacturers, and the ingredients, and he named the dead. The opening line of the series set the register. Gullible America will spend this year some $75 million in the purchase of patent medicines. $75 million in 1905. Adams treated this not as a curiosity, but as a crime scene, and he walked his readers through it with the patience of a prosecutor building a case. He documented products containing opium sold for infant colic. He documented catarrh cures that were mostly cocaine. He documented tuberculosis remedies that contained nothing capable of treating tuberculosis and everything capable of masking its symptoms until the patient was beyond help. He documented the advertising agreements between patent medicine companies and newspapers, contracts that included clauses voiding the advertising deal if the state in which the newspaper operated passed any law restricting patent medicine sales. The newspapers weren't just failing to investigate, they were contractually obligated not to. Adams published this in a magazine with a circulation large enough to reach the professional class, the legislators, the doctors, the lawyers, the people whose opinions shaped policy. And he published it with a specificity that made legal action against him nearly impossible, because everything he printed was verifiable. The products existed, the ingredients were what he said they were, and the people were dead. Together, Bach and Adams accomplished what Wiley's data alone could not. They made the patent medicine industry's practices legible to the public as a coherent system of fraud rather than a collection of individual bad actors. They showed that the problem was not one dishonest company, but an entire marketplace structured to reward dishonesty and punish disclosure. A manufacturer who listed ingredients honestly was at a competitive disadvantage against one who didn't, because the honest label would reveal contents that the customer would refuse to buy. Then came Sinclair. Upton. Sinclair was 26 years old in 1904 when he went to Chicago. He had received a $500 advance from the socialist newspaper Appeal to Reason to investigate conditions in the meatpacking district. His subject was labor. His sympathies were with the immigrant workers, Lithuanian and Polish and Czech families, who processed the nation's meat supply for wages that couldn't sustain a household and under conditions that destroyed their bodies within years. He spent 7 weeks inside the stockyards and packing houses, observing and interviewing, and then he went home and wrote a novel. The Jungle was published in February 1906, and its impact was immediate, enormous, and almost entirely misaimed. Sinclair had written hundreds of pages about the crushing poverty of immigrant workers, about wages stolen and injuries ignored, about families destroyed by an economic system that treated human labor as a consumable resource. The public ignored nearly all of it. What the public read, what the public remembered, what the public could not stop talking about, were the passages describing what went into the meat. Rats running across sausage-making floors, workers falling into rendering vats and being processed along with the animal carcasses, diseased cattle approved for consumption, meat stored in rooms where water dripped from ceilings and pooled on floors, where men walked through it and tracked it to every surface. Sinclair had intended these details as context, as evidence of an industry so contemptuous of human life that it would poison its customers as readily as it exploited its workers. The public separated the two halves. They were horrified by what they were eating. They were largely indifferent to who was suffering to prepare it. Sinclair said it himself, and the bitterness in it has outlasted everything else he wrote. I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident I hit it in the stomach. The stomach was enough. The jungle reached President Theodore Roosevelt, who ordered an independent investigation of the meatpacking industry. The investigators confirmed that Sinclair's descriptions, if anything, understated the conditions. And suddenly, in the spring of 1906, the political deadlock that had persisted since the Poison Squad began generating headlines broke open. Public outrage was no longer abstract. It was specific, visceral, and attached to something every American did 3 times a day, eating. The Pure Food and Drug Act passed the Senate on February 21, 1906. The Meat Inspection Act, drafted in direct response to Sinclair's novel and the investigations it triggered, was signed alongside it. Roosevelt signed both into law on June 30, 1906. Harvey Wiley, who had spent 23 years building the scientific foundation for this moment, finally had a law to enforce. And the law was not enough. It sounds ungrateful to say it after 23 years of congressional paralysis. It sounds churlish after the Poison Squad and the Muckrakers and a novel that changed how a nation thought about its food. But the 1906 Act, examined closely, was a law shaped as much by the industries it regulated as by the public outrage that demanded it. What it required was accurate labeling. What it prohibited was adulteration and misbranding. What it did not require was proof of safety before a product reached the market. What it did not prohibit was a manufacturer putting anything it pleased in a bottle, as long as the label correctly identified the contents. Representative James Mann of Illinois stood on the House floor on June 21, 1906, and held up a bottle of cherries. Originally picked green, he explained. The green color removed with acid until the cherries were perfectly white, then colored with an aniline dye, which was poisonous in any quantity. This was legal before the Act. After the Act, it would still be legal, provided the label disclosed the dye. The question was never whether people would buy poisoned cherries if they knew the cherries were poisoned. The question was whether disclosure alone constituted protection. The patent medicine industry answered that question within 5 years. In 1911, the Supreme Court ruled in U.S. v. Johnson that the 1906 Act did not prohibit false therapeutic claims, only false statements about a product's ingredients or identity. A manufacturer could accurately list every ingredient on the label and then claim the product cured tuberculosis, cancer, and kidney disease, and the federal government had no authority to stop them, because the law Wiley had fought for prohibited lying about what was in the bottle but said nothing about lying about what the bottle could do. Congress attempted a repair. The Shirley Amendment of 1912 added therapeutic claims to the definition of misbranding, but only if those claims were false and fraudulent required proving intent. The government now had to demonstrate not just that a claim was false, but that the manufacturer knew it was false and made it anyway with the purpose of deceiving. A manufacturer who genuinely believed his sugar water cured cancer, or who could plausibly claim to believe it, was beyond the reach of the law. Wiley watched this happen from inside his own bureau. The enforcement authority he had spent decades building was being systematically dismantled, not by repeal, but by reinterpretation. The Secretary of Agriculture appointed a referee board of consulting scientific experts, led by Ira Remsen, a chemist whose connections to industry were a matter of public record. The referee board overturned Wiley's findings on benzoate of soda. It overturned his findings on saccharin. It substituted its own judgment for the Bureau of Chemistry's on question after question, and it consistently found that the substances Wiley had documented as harmful were, in the board's assessment, acceptable. Wiley resigned in March of 1912. He was 67 years old. He had spent 29 years as chief chemist of the USDA, and he left with a law that bore his influence in every line and that was, by the time he walked out, being enforced by people who did not share his conclusions about what it meant. The 1906 Act remained the foundation of federal food and drug regulation for the next 31 years. It required honest labels. It did not require safe products. And for 3 decades, that distinction persisted as background noise, a known flaw in a system that mostly worked well enough that no one with political power felt compelled to fix it. What changed that calculation was not journalism. It was not a novel. It was not a chemist with data and a squad of volunteers. It was 107 dead Americans, most of them children. In the fall of 1937, the S.E. Massengill Company of Bristol, Tennessee, had a problem that seemed simple. Sulfanilamide was the first effective antibiotic available to American doctors, a genuine medical advance that could treat streptococcal infections that had previously been untreatable. It came in tablet and powder form. Patients who couldn't swallow tablets, particularly children, needed a liquid version. The company's chief chemist, Harold Cole Watkins, was tasked with finding a solvent that would dissolve the drug and taste acceptable to a child. Watkins tested several options and found that diethylene glycol worked. The drug dissolved readily. Watkins added raspberry flavoring to mask the solvent's mildly sweet taste, tested the mixture for appearance and flavor, and declared it ready for production. He called it elixir sulfanilamide. He did not test it for toxicity because no law required him to. No regulation demanded that a pharmaceutical company demonstrate a product would not kill the people who took it before shipping it across the country. Diethylene glycol is a chemical cousin of ethylene glycol, the primary component of antifreeze. In the human body, it is metabolized into compounds that destroy the kidneys. Death from diethylene glycol poisoning is not quick. It takes days, sometimes more than a week, and it involves progressive kidney failure, severe abdominal pain, and, in children, a level of suffering that the doctors who witnessed it described in language they rarely used in clinical correspondence. The Massengill Company shipped 240 gallons of elixir sulfanilamide to pharmacies across 15 states in September and October of 1937. Within weeks, reports of deaths began reaching the American Medical Association. The FDA launched what became one of the most desperate product recalls in American history, sending inspectors across the country to locate and retrieve every bottle. They were chasing a product that was already in homes, already in medicine cabinets, already being spooned into the mouths of sick children by parents who believed they were helping. At least 107 people died. The precise number varies by source because some deaths were likely never connected to the elixir. Many of the dead were children. Dr. A.S. Calhoun, a physician who lost patients to the product, wrote a letter that survives in the historical record. The realization has given me such days and nights of mental and spiritual agony as I did not believe a human being could undergo and survive. The FDA could seize the remaining product, but the legal basis for the seizure reveals the full absurdity of the regulatory framework that existed in 1937. The agency could not seize elixir sulfanilamide because it was poisonous. The 1906 Act contained no provision allowing seizure on safety grounds. The FDA seized it because the label said elixir, a term that technically implies an alcohol-based solution. The product's solvent was diethylene glycol, not alcohol, so the label was inaccurate. That was the crime, not the killing, the mislabeling. Harold Cole Watkins, the chemist who formulated the product, was found dead in 1939. He had taken his own life. There were no criminal charges he could have faced because he had broken no law. He had done exactly what the regulatory system permitted him to do. He had put a chemical in a bottle without testing whether it was safe, because for 31 years, since the day the Pure Food and Drug Act was signed, no one had ever been required to answer that question before selling the answer to the public. 107 people were dead because a law passed in the aftermath of poisoned food, and fraudulent medicine had never required the most basic question a consumer might ask. Will this kill me? What would it take to make that question mandatory? It took 107 dead. That was the price. And Congress, which had stalled consumer protection legislation for more than 3 decades, passed the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act in 1938, less than a year after the last child died from elixir sulfanilamide. For the first time in American history, a pharmaceutical company would be required to prove that a new drug was safe before it could be sold, before people started dying, before the FDA had to chase bottles across 15 states, pre-market safety testing. The concept seems so obvious, so elementary, that it's difficult to hold in your mind that it took until 1938 to become law, and that it required the deaths of more than 100 people, many of them children, to get there. But the act didn't emerge from a vacuum, and it didn't emerge from the outrage alone. It emerged from a drafting process, and that process had a room, and the room had chairs, and the people sitting in those chairs shaped the law as much as the dead had demanded it. The Proprietary Association was there. This was the patent medicine lobby, the direct descendants of the men who'd sold Hostetter's bitters and Lydia Pinkham's compound, now organized, now sophisticated, now employing attorneys who understood that the worst outcome wasn't regulation itself, but regulation they couldn't influence. The Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association was there, representing the companies that made the legitimate drugs, the ones that actually worked, the ones prescribed by actual doctors. And the American Medical Association was there, supporting strong drug regulation, with a conviction that aligned neatly with its institutional interests, because every patent medicine pulled from the market was a product that had been competing with physician-prescribed treatments. Every bottle of opium-laced cough syrup removed from a drugstore shelf was a patient who might now visit a doctor instead. This isn't to say the AMA's support was cynical. The physicians who'd watched their patients die from sulfanilamide had every reason to demand better, but it's worth noting that the organization most enthusiastically pushing for strict drug regulation was also the organization most directly positioned to benefit from it. The interests aligned. They don't always. The 1938 Act transformed the FDA from something closer to a policing agency, one that caught violations after the fact, into a regulatory body, one that could prevent harm before it occurred. That's a structural change, not a cosmetic one. It meant that a company like Massengill could no longer ship 240 gallons of untested liquid across 15 states and then shrug when people died, because the law now said you had to test it first. You had to demonstrate safety. You had to answer the question before you sold the answer to the public. But the act also did something else, something quieter, something that would matter for decades. It split jurisdiction over drugs between two agencies. The FDA retained authority over drug labeling, the words printed on the bottle, the package insert, the information that traveled physically with the product. The Federal Trade Commission received authority over drug advertising, the claims made in newspapers, on the radio, eventually on television. This sounds like a sensible division of labor. It was, in practice, a gap, because labeling and advertising are not two separate conversations. They're the same conversation happening in two places. And when two different agencies are responsible for policing two halves of the same claim, what happens in the space between them is predictable. A company could be cautious on its label because the FDA was watching, and expansive in its advertising, because the FTC had different standards, different enforcement priorities, different resources. The gap wasn't an accident, it was a compromise. Worked out in the same room where the Proprietary Association and the pharmaceutical manufacturers sat with their attorneys. They couldn't stop the law, so they shaped it. They introduced the seams, and yet 107 people were dead, and the law was better than it had been. Dr. Calhoun, the physician who'd written about the mental and spiritual agony of watching his patients die from something he'd prescribed, who'd lost his best friend to a raspberry-flavored poison, could now practice medicine in a country where the next Harold Cole Watkins would at least be required to test a solvent before putting it in a bottle. That's not nothing. It's not everything either. And the people who wrote the margins of the law knew it wouldn't be everything, but it's not nothing. So the framework was in place by 1938. Pre-market safety testing for drugs. Expanded authority over food standards. Two agencies dividing the work of keeping deceptive claims away from the public. The question that followed wasn't whether the system existed, it was who would enforce it, and against whom, and how hard. Because the industries that had fought Harvey Wiley for 20 years, that had stalled legislation through 1905, that had lobbied to weaken the 1906 Act before the ink was dry, that had shaped the 1938 Act to include jurisdictional seams they could exploit, those industries didn't disappear. They didn't accept the new reality and move on. They adapted. They found the next fight, and the next, and the next. And the pattern they established is so durable that you can trace it across the entire 20th century without ever losing the thread. In the 1950s, the fight was over pesticide residues in food. The science was increasingly clear that certain chemicals used in agriculture were appearing in the food supply at measurable levels. Congress responded in 1958 with the Delaney Clause, an amendment to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that prohibited any food additive found to cause cancer in humans or animals. Zero tolerance. No safe level. If it caused cancer in a lab rat, it couldn't be in the food supply. On paper, the clause was the most uncompromising piece of consumer protection legislation since the 1938 Act itself. But pesticide residues created what became known as the Delaney paradox. Were pesticide residues food additives? They weren't added to food intentionally. They were residues, traces left behind by chemicals applied to crops in the field. The distinction mattered enormously, because if pesticide residues weren't food additives, the Delaney Clause didn't apply to them, and they could be regulated under a different, more permissive standard that allowed acceptable levels of risk. The chemical industry argued, with significant resources and significant success, that pesticide residues were fundamentally different from food additives. The debate lasted decades, scientifically complex but also structurally identical to the argument that borax manufacturers had made in 1905, that the dose made the poison, that small amounts were acceptable, that the government shouldn't prohibit what the market tolerated. The language was more sophisticated. The logic was the same. It took until 1996, nearly 40 years after the Delaney Clause was written, for Congress to pass the Food Quality Protection Act, which removed pesticide residues from the clause's scope entirely. The zero-tolerance standard for carcinogenic additives in food remained, but the chemicals most commonly found in the food supply were no longer subject to it. The industry hadn't repealed the Delaney Clause. It had simply moved the most relevant chemicals out from under it. The wall still stood, the door was just around the side. The fight was over saccharin. The FDA, following the Delaney Clause's logic, moved to ban the artificial sweetener after studies showed it caused bladder cancer in rats. The public response was immediate and furious. Saccharin was, by 1977, used by millions of Americans. Diabetics relied on it. Dieters relied on it. The sugar industry supported the ban because of course it did, but the outcry was loud enough and organized enough that Congress didn't allow the ban to take effect. Instead, they passed the Saccharin Study and Labeling Act, which imposed a moratorium on the ban and required warning labels. Labels, not removal from the market. The compromise was familiar. The same structure that had defined the 1906 Act, accurate labeling rather than safety requirements, reappeared 70 years later, wearing different clothes. The industry didn't have to prove saccharin was safe. The government had to accept that proving it was dangerous wasn't enough, not if enough consumers wanted to keep buying it. And then, in 1994, came the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act, DSHEA. If you wanted to understand the durability of the pattern, if you wanted to trace the line from Hostetter's bitters in 1853 all the way to the present, this is where you draw the sharpest connection. DSHEA exempted most dietary supplements from pre-market safety review. Under this law, the FDA cannot approve a supplement before it reaches the market. It cannot require testing. It cannot demand evidence of safety or efficacy before the product is sold. The burden of proof falls entirely on the agency. The FDA must demonstrate that a product already on the shelves is causing harm before it can act. The company selling the product has no obligation to prove it's safe beforehand. Think about that structure for a moment. A product can be sold to the public without testing, without pre-market approval, without any demonstration of safety. The government can only act after harm is already occurring. That's not the 1938 framework. That's the 1906 framework. In some respects, it's the pre-1906 framework, the one that allowed Harold Cole Watkins to dissolve a drug in antifreeze and ship it across the country without anyone asking whether it would kill people. DSHEA didn't apply to pharmaceuticals, of course. The 1938 Act still governs prescription drugs. But the supplement market in the United States generates tens of billions of dollars annually, and the products on those shelves exist in a regulatory environment that Harvey Wiley would have recognized instantly, because it's the environment he spent 20 years trying to dismantle. Wiley himself saw it coming, or something like it. In his autobiography, published in 1929, 3 years before his death, he wrote that the Pure Food and Drug Act had been annulled by its friends. That was his word, annulled. Made void not by its opponents but by the people who claimed to support it, while quietly weakening its enforcement, underfunding its agencies, appointing administrators sympathetic to the industries they were meant to regulate. Wiley had watched it happen in real time. He'd resigned from the Bureau of Chemistry in 1912 because the compromises had become intolerable, because the law he'd spent 2 decades fighting for was being hollowed out from within before it was 10 years old. The pattern is the thing, not any single law or disaster or reformer, but the pattern itself. A product harms people. The harm becomes public. Outrage builds. Legislation passes. And then industries adapt to the legislation, find its margins, exploit its jurisdictional seams, fund campaigns to weaken enforcement, lobby for exemptions that restore, in practice, the freedom they'd lost on paper. The cycle repeats. The question each time is the same, and it's never fully answered, because the answer depends on who you ask and what they stand to gain. What's the right amount of government between a company and a customer? How much freedom should a manufacturer have to sell a product without proving it's safe? How much responsibility should fall on the buyer to investigate what's in the bottle? Harvey Wiley had an answer. The Proprietary Association had a different one. Samuel Hopkins Adams, Upton Sinclair, Edward Bach, they all had answers. The parents who spooned raspberry-flavored diethylene glycol into their children's mouths in 1937, trusting the company that made it, trusting the pharmacist who sold it, trusting the system that permitted it, they had an answer too, but nobody asked them until it was too late. The framework that exists today is not the product of consensus. It's the product of catastrophe, negotiated by interests, weakened by compromise, and periodically rebuilt when enough people die that doing nothing becomes politically impossible. Every protection on the books was purchased with a specific harm. Every exception to those protections was purchased with money, influence, and patience. And the question Wiley asked, the question the muckrakers asked, the question that 107 Dead answered in 1937, remains open. It's open right now, today, in the gap between what a company is permitted to sell and what a customer is able to verify. It's been open for 170 years. Nobody has closed it. The argument is only over how wide it gets to be.